Actually, I spoke here at one of the earlier sessions of this series a couple of years ago, following Amy, and I've had that experience a number of times. It's a very humbling experience and really unfair because the instinct I have is just to say, you know, I endorse everything she said in this inspiring way, which I can't duplicate. But this is much worse. This is really unfair. I've never had the experience of speaking after one and Amy, and that's hopeless. So I probably ought to just shut up, but I'll say a few words anyway. Both of them brought up issues of media. I'll start by saying something about that. There's a very high ideal that's celebrated by especially the elite media, and that's to maintain objectivity. Objectivity has a very definite meaning in media culture. It means repeating accurately anything that's said within the beltway. If you do that, it's objective. If you go beyond that, it's biased, subjective, emotional, and so on and so forth. Now, there's another concept, reality. And objectivity and reality often don't quite match. In fact, quite often there's a huge gap between them. Sort of obedient by nature, I'll start by talking about objectivity and move very quickly to reality. And I'll keep to... oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
See if this is better.
Is any better? Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. That's all right. I'll hold it. Yeah. Sorry, my voice isn't very good. I'll keep the foreign policy, given the topic of the general event. There's plenty to say beyond, and you've heard a lot. On foreign policy, there are some issues where conformity is so overwhelming, there's basically nothing to say. There's only objectivity, namely repeating what everybody says. So for one example, which in fact was brought up, was President Obama's global assassination campaign, the drone campaign. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, there are countries that have had assassination campaigns. Pinochet's Chile, South Africa had one. Khomeini's Iran had one. Israel's had one for years. But there's nothing remotely like the sophistication and scale of Obama's campaign. We've read a lot about it, and what's written about it is pretty interesting. As you know, I'm sure, the decisions are made in the White House by the president after having read passages from St. Augustine and discussed them with his priestly advisor. And I won't tell you what the rules are, you know about them. And then they murder anybody they like. There's a little discussion of this in an interesting way. There's a little bit of a flicker of interest over the fact that they sometimes kill American citizens. So when they killed an American cleric in Yemen, Awlaki, there was kind of a little talk, maybe it's nice to kill Americans. They also happened to kill his companion in the car, who's also an American. A couple of weeks later, killed his son, 16-year-old son, also an American. So a little rumble about that. But killing anybody else is just fine. We don't. The only question is how much you should do it. There was an interesting article in the Times, you may have read it, by Scott Shane, one of the reporters who actually presented the White House version of how all this is done with great pride. And he said, yeah, there's some moral questions. But the last line of his article was, look, it's better than Dresden, which is true, we could do worse. And that's roughly the range of objectivity. Should we do Dresden or should we do global assassination? Actually, the same disparity shows up in the NDAA case, which you know about. I was a plaintiff in it, but I felt kind of uneasy about it. The NDAA case was about, it focused on the fact that the legislation that was passed and that Obama signed and that he's now taking to a higher court to try to get enacted, that legislation allows the government in principle to carry out preventive detention without trial indefinitely of American citizens. And we're not supposed to like that. But what about anybody else? I mean, this violates principles going back to the Magna Carta in 1215, which says that no one shall be deprived of rights without a due process of law and a speedy trial by peers. It's actually written into the American Constitution, Fifth and Sixth Amendments. So that's all being scrapped, and it's okay, but there's a little question about Americans. Why should we accept that? Why should we even pursue it? Well, this is all beyond discussion. So here we're just talking about objectivity. Now, the same is true of something else, which I don't know if you followed, but it's worth getting your eye on. One of the new expansions of the remarkable state that's being constructed by the president is the disposition matrix. It's a very interesting idea. There's a huge surveillance system all over the world collecting huge amounts of information about anyone the government thinks might someday, want to do something we don't like. And you feed all of it, most of the information, that kind of information is, not even worth laughing at. But whatever it is, it goes into a major computer system, which is collecting enormous amounts of data, and it somehow links up in ways that haven't been explained yet to another computer system which is collecting huge amounts of data about Americans. And from this data, the government is supposed to cull information about who it wants to dispose of. That's the disposition matrix. What that's going to be, nobody really knows. There's no precedent for this. There's been a little talk about it, but only objective talk, just repeating the few words that are said inside the Beltway. Well, since I'm talking about foreign policy, here there's a very easy way in this case to give an objective account of the issues in international affairs. For example, you can look at the last presidential debate, if you can bear it. Amy's forced to do it for professional reasons, but the rest of us can skip it. But as I'm sure you know, there were two words in the presidential debate that absolutely dwarfed anything else, overwhelmed everything else. The one word was Israel, the other word was Iran. Israel, because each candidate had to express their overflowing adoration for Israel and everything it does. And incidentally, for Obama, this is nothing new. I wrote about him just using his disgraceful web page before the primaries in 2008. It was shocking. But this time he had to exceed his opponent, who was also overflowing with awe and adoration. So that's Israel. Why Iran? Well, two reasons. One, Iran is a threat to Israel, maybe even an existential threat. And two, it's the greatest threat to peace in the world. That's hammered in over and over. Now, if you look at the media the next day, they were quite objective. They reported calmly that Iran is the greatest threat to peace in the world. After all, that's objective reporting. And this continues in more indirect ways. So a couple of days later, in fact, the day before the election, take a look at the New York Times. There was full page with topics in it. The top story, top half of the page, was about a discussion, a debate that took place in the Israeli cabinet a couple of years ago, 2010, about whether to just go ahead and bomb Iran or whether to wait. And there's a discussion of the debate, and it goes into the pragmatic issues. Can you manage it? Can you get away with it? Will it be hard to refuel the planes? The kind of thing one was talking about. And they finally decided, well, this isn't the time for it. The tone of the discussion is interesting. There's been a series of discussions like it. Not long before, the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, was asked about Israel bombing Iran. He said, well, we don't really think it's a good idea, but they're a sovereign country, so if they feel like doing it, it's their business. We have nothing to say about it. What everyone should do when you read that is reverse it. Do a thought experiment. Suppose there was a report about an Iranian meeting planning to bomb Israel and deciding whether they could get away with it or whether it wouldn't work quite right and so on. Would we have this reaction? Actually, you know what reaction you'd have. Take the alleged comment by Ahmadinejad that one exposed as a fraud years ago, but it keeps resounding over and over. It came back today. It's too good to lose. That they have to wipe Israel off the map. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false or anything. It's good to use, so we use it. I mean, that's been a major, that non-charge by a non-person has been a major part of the propaganda campaign against Iran. Suppose something happened like what happened in the Israeli cabinet. Well, I'll leave it to your imagination. The bottom half of the page is about Israel. There was a comment by Abbas, actually technically, well, he's called the president of the head of the Palestinian Authority, actually isn't, but in which he made a comment in which he said that he'd like to visit the town where he was born, Safed, but he wouldn't want to go back and live there. And that caused a huge furor, different kind of furor in the Mideast and here. The furor here was, well, maybe this means that finally Israel and the United States have a partner for peace, which they've been yearning for and striving for years, but Palestinians and Arabs generally are so outrageous and impossible that they've never been able to have a partner for peace. So maybe there's a chance now. Well, let me say a couple of words about each of these cases of objectivity. So I'll start with Iran. Three questions should immediately come to mind when you read that Iran is the greatest threat to peace in the world. The first question is, who thinks so? The second question is, what's the threat? And the third question is, if there is a threat, what should we be doing about it? Okay, so let's look at those. Well, who thinks so? Pretty simple answer. It's a Western obsession. Most of the world doesn't think so. The non-aligned movement, which is most of the countries in the world, most of the people in the world by far, just had one of their regular meetings. This one was in Tehran. And once again, they strongly endorsed Iran's right to enrich uranium. They harshly condemned the sanctions, and they called for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. I'll come back to that. I don't think there was a word about that because to report it wouldn't be objective. Nobody in the Beltway said anything about it. So it's not them. Well, what about the Arab world? You know, they're right there. That's an interesting case. Public opinion in the Arab world has repeatedly been polled by the leading U.S. polling agencies, and the results are interesting. They do see threats. The two major threats that they see are Israel and the United States. They don't like Iran. That's hostilities that go back forever. But they don't regard Iran as a threat. Very small numbers regard Iran as a threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that in most of these polls, pretty high numbers, think that the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. Now, they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, of course, but to balance U.S. and Israeli power, maybe that would be better. To report that, again, would not be objective. Nobody says that in the Beltway, and you have to look really hard to find mention of it. I've found a couple of words in the mainstream press. What you do see is something different, that the Arabs support us on Iran. That's heralded all over the place. In fact, WikiLeaks was interpreted as saying that, with big headlines about how maybe WikiLeaks is being run by the CIA because they're giving such great information. And it's not totally false, but you have to ask who they're referring to. Which Arabs? Well, it turns out the Arab dictators. Some of the Arab dictators support U.S. policy. And if the dictators support us and the population overwhelmingly opposes us, that means the Arabs support us. That teaches us something about how deep-seated the contempt for democracy is and the fear and hatred of democracy. And that shows up right away in the Arab Spring. Everything you read, Thomas Friedman this morning or anything else, that talks about how much the United States loves the pressure for democracy in the Arab world. It's exactly the opposite. Pressure for democracy in the Arab world is terrifying to U.S. leaders. There's a very elementary reason. Just take a look at the public opinion polls. To the extent that a democracy is functioning, public opinion has an influence on policy. So does the United States want, say, Egypt to follow policies based on the idea that the major threats they face are Israel and the United States, Iran isn't a threat, and Iran should develop nuclear weapons to balance the U.S.? No, they don't want that. So they have to be against democracy. And if you look at the actual record, you can see that that's exactly the way it works. I won't run through it because there's no time, but it's straightforward. However, this is going outside the realm of objectivity into reality. That's a dangerous step. That's the who question. What about the what question? What's the threat? What one said is accurate, I think, and it comes from the most authoritative sources, absolutely most authoritative sources, the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence. They provide, every year, they provide an analysis to Congress of the global security situation, of course, a big section on Iran, and they talk about the Iranian threat. What they conclude is that Iran has very limited capacity to deploy force. It has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region. I mean, incomparably less than us or our allies. It has a strategic doctrine. The doctrine is defensive, to try to deter direct invasion long enough for diplomacy to set in. And they say if, and they don't know because nobody knows, they say if they're trying to develop a nuclear capability, what Juan was talking about, that would be part of their deterrence strategy. And if you just think about the geostrategic situation, which is obvious enough so I won't talk about it, it's hard to imagine a country that has a greater need for a deterrent. It's almost obvious. So maybe they're doing it as part of their deterrent strategy. That's the main threat. There's a secondary threat. They're destabilizing the region. How are they destabilizing the region? They're trying to extend their influence in neighboring countries, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So when we invade and destroy the countries, that's stabilizing. When they try to expand their commercial, political, cultural influence, that's destabilizing. Well, all of this fits together and makes perfect sense on the principle that we own the world. So we have to have a right to do anything we want anywhere. And that's a dominant principle of policy, not not just the U.S., it's the kind of policy that flows from overwhelming power. Nobody's ever been anywhere near as powerful as the U.S. is, but you get similar theses measured by the level of power that a state has. We're kind of out of sight, so it's enormous. And in fact, one of the most significant developments in the world today is that while the U.S. still formally maintains the principle that we own the world, and the policies that flow from it, the capacity to implement those policies is declining. And that's causing tremendous fear in the establishment. As much fear as you find in the white community here when they see that they're going to be a minority pretty soon. You can read Foreign Affairs, main establishment journal, a couple of months ago, front cover, announcing the topic of the issue, big black letters, is America over? ? Because we can't anymore fully implement the policies of the last 70 years based on the principle that we own the world. And this is a common theme right through establishment discourse. Well, that's worth thinking about too. I simply endorse what Juan said about it. Well, that's the what question. So that's who thinks is the threat and what the threat is. How about doing something about it? Okay, so let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that Iran does pose a threat. Okay, what can you do about it? The threat is that they're allegedly trying to develop nuclear weapons. Can you do anything about that? Well, there's something very simple you can do. One thing you could do is follow the advice of the non-aligned movement. Move to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Now, that's not new. That goes back a long time. For the last roughly 20 years, Egypt in particular has been pressing hard for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. It goes back before that. The pressure is so strong that on the regular non-proliferation treaty meetings, the U.S. has been compelled to endorse it. Clinton endorsed it. Bush twice, once every 5 years. Bush refused to endorse it. Obama endorsed it, but added a qualification. It's a nice idea, but not now. And furthermore, it has to exclude Israel. In fact, it has to exclude even any commitment to any country to provide information about Israel's nuclear weapons program, meaning us. So great idea, but this condition has to be met first. By accident, that happens to be Israel's policy. Their policy is that wonderful idea, but first we have to have complete regional peace, and everyone has to accept Israel's right to exist and other things that can be put off indefinitely. Well, okay, that kills the possibility of solving whatever the problem is in a simple way. Now, how could that be changed? It could be changed if there was a mass popular movement in the United States calling for implementing this proposal. But there can't be a mass popular movement until somebody knows about it. At this point, you look at the objective behavior of the media. And here I think it's 100%. I have not seen one word maybe you can find one, in the mainstream media, even referring to this. Now that's pretty striking because it's imminent. There's a conference coming up in a couple of months in Helsinki to try to move forward on establishing a nuclear-free weapons zone. Israel's already made it pretty clear they're not going to attend. The U.S. won't do anything unless pressed. The media, with perhaps 100% uniformity, which would be pretty impressive, even in a totalitarian state, have refused even to mention it. Try to find an exception. Well, that's how you could deal with it. Incidentally, this is not the only nuclear weapons-free zone in the world. There are others that countries have been trying to implement. One is in Africa. The African countries did agree to establish a nuclear-free weapon zone, but they can't. The reason they can't is because there's an island in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia, which was a British dependency, actually belongs to African country. But the United States asked or ordered, you pick it, England to kick out the inhabitants so that the U.S. could establish a major military base. It's one of the major military bases that Washington uses for bombing the Middle East and Central Asia. And Obama built that base up much faster. He expanded it, in fact, to accommodate nuclear submarines with nuclear-tipped missiles and other ways, expanded it enormously. Now, as long as that base has nuclear weapons, Africa can't implement its nuclear-free weapon zone. There's another zone in the Pacific. The Pacific countries have tried to implement a nuclear-free weapon zone. At first, it was blocked by France 15, 20 years ago, because France wanted to carry out nuclear tests in its Pacific dependencies. Okay, that's long over. Now it's blocked by the United States, because the United States insists that its Pacific dependencies accommodate nuclear weapons installations. So that's another possibility of moving towards the nuclear-free world that Obama is very, has this wonderful soaring rhetoric, as it's called, about. But the crucial one is the Middle East one. And it's also worth adding something else that doesn't get reported, but is quite important. Of all the countries in the world, the United States and Britain have a unique obligation to move in this direction for a very simple reason. You recall that when the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, they tried to provide a kind of a thin legal cover. Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. Well, we don't have to talk about the outcome of that. But that was the cover, and that went back to, and they invoked a Security Council resolution from 1991, 687, which called on Iraq to abandon its nuclear weapons policies, weapons of mass destruction policies. You read that resolution, and it also adds a commitment by the signers to move to a nuclear-free weapon zone in the region. Okay? Now that imposes a very powerful obligation on the two countries that carried out some of the worst aggression in recent years on the basis of that resolution. Try to find a word about that. No. Okay, that's how you can deal with it. In fact, whatever the threat is, there's a very simple way of dealing it, mitigating it or ending it. But can't happen unless people know. They can't know unless the media move beyond objectivity to reality. And incidentally, it's not just the media, it's the media and the whole intellectual community. It's not just the United States, it's the whole West. A lot of work to do on the major threat to peace in the world, allegedly. Well, let's turn to Israel and the United States yearning for a negotiating partner in Israel-Palestine. It's a very interesting history. I wish I had time to go through it, but I'll just pick a few of the points. The issue of Israel-Palestine reached the international agenda after Israel's conquest of the occupied territories, 1967. And the U.S. did have a policy at that time, official policy. The policy was in accord with UN Resolution 242, which everyone formally accepts at least. U.S. policy was that Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories back to the international border with perhaps minor and mutual modifications. So the international border was in fact a ceasefire line. So okay, straighten out the line here and there. That was U.S. policy until 1971. At that point, something quite significant happened. The president of Egypt, Sadat, accepted a proposal from the international negotiator to have a full peace treaty with Israel, total peace treaty, everything, a normalization and so on, if Israel would withdraw from the occupied territories. And in fact, the only part he really cared about was Egyptian territory, the Sinai. Actually, Jordan made a similar offer right after. So here was a possibility to have total security, but without expansion. There was a choice. Are we going to have security or expansion? I think it's the most fateful choice in Israel's history. If Egypt was out of the conflict, it's the only serious Arab army, so okay, you've got security. The Israeli cabinet decided against it. They were putting in motion plans to develop the Sinai, a big Jewish city on the Mediterranean, a lot of colonies and so on. The question is always, what's the U.S. going to do about it? That's what determines. Well, there was an internal debate in the United States. The State Department was in favor of it. It was pretty much their program, in fact. But there was somebody else involved, a character named Henry Kissinger. He was against it, probably because he wanted to take over the State Department. It's probably internal bickering. But his policy, as he said, was what he called stalemate. No negotiations, just force. And it was, he assumed, and others assumed at the time, that Israel was so overwhelmingly powerful that they could disregard the Arabs. Long story. And Kissinger prevailed. And since that time, Israel, backed by the United States, has devoted its efforts, international efforts, to expansion at the expense of security. Now, this changed a little in the mid-70s. The official U.S. policy and UN 242 didn't say anything about Palestinian rights, and nor did Sadat's offer. They were just treated as refugees. But by about 1975, that changed. The issue of Palestinian national rights reached the international agenda, and that caused problems for the U.S. In January 1976, a Security Council resolution was brought by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the main Arab states, calling for a two-state settlement on the international border with a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, Israel and a Palestinian state. And then it included all the wording of UN 242. So with guarantees for the right of every state in the region to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. U.S. vetoed it. When the U.S. vetoes a resolution, it's a double veto. It doesn't happen, and it's vetoed from history. And objective commentators don't refer to it. So try to find some, you can find, it's documented, there's no debate about the facts, but try to find some mention. Same thing happened in 1980, same resolution, this time Carter vetoed it. And long story since, I won't run through it. The most recent U.S. veto in the Security Council actually did get a little commentary because it was so outlandish. Now, that's Obama in February 2011. A resolution came to the Security Council calling on Israel to live up to official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy, the verbiage you hear, is don't expand settlements. It's a very minor issue, incidentally. The issue is the settlements, which are totally illegal. There's no question about that. Not the expansion. But the Security Council resolution was weak. It reiterated U.S. policy, and Obama vetoed it. That's February 2011. That pretty much ended any talk of settlement expansion. Well, quickly, since there's only another minute, what are the options there? How do you deal with the problem? I mean, of all the problems in the world, this may be one of the easiest to deal with. I mean, it's always called intractable, impossible, no negotiating partner, and so on. It's all perfect nonsense. There's an overwhelming international consensus, includes essentially everyone, the Arab states, Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, the non-aligned movement, everyone. calling for essentially the 1976 resolution. One thing stands in the way, the United States. Of course, Israel doesn't like it, but they can't do anything unless the U.S. backs them, small country. So it's in our hands. The U.S. continues to block it. The U.S. does call for negotiations, but take a look at the kind of negotiations it's calling for. They have two crucial preconditions. One precondition is they'll be run by the United States. The United States is not a neutral party. It's a participant, along with Israel, in blocking it. This makes about as much sense as proposing that Shiite-Sunni conflicts in Iraq should be mediated by Iran. Anybody said that, you'd burst out laughing. But this is the same. It's saying that the major party that has blocked negotiations for 35 years should run the negotiations. The second condition is that settlement expansion must continue. Furthermore, must continue even when it's formally stopped. You see references to a 10-month stop in expansion, but that's a joke. Take a look at what happened. All sorts of devices were allowed to keep them from expanding. So those are the two preconditions. Yeah, let's have negotiations that are run by the country that's been blocking settlement for 35 years, and let's ensure that the major issue, expansion of the settlement, continues. I should say, there's a lot to say about Gaza, no time, but one thing is crucial. If you go back to the Oslo Agreements, 1993, celebrated with great awe. I won't go into what was wrong with them, but one crucial element in them was that Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial entity. Its integrity cannot be broken. Right away, the United States and Israel initiated programs to separate them. They're by now totally separated. If you're Gaza is a kind of a cage. You can't get out of it. But if somebody in Gaza wants to go to a college in the West Bank, visit their cousin, go to a hospital in a West Bank hospital, almost virtually impossible. I mean, you can maybe find half a dozen cases where it happened, but essentially impossible. People die in Gaza because they can't get medical treatment because it would mean they're going to the part of their territory, which is one unit. Well, again, objectivity doesn't allow reference and discussion of this. Just to summarize very quickly, the two major issues that the presidential candidates debated, the greatest threat to peace in the world, Iran, and Israel's need, its yearning for peace and our efforts to try to bring it about, there's a response to those, a simple one. The United States, in the case of Iran, is a straightforward solution, nuclear weapons-free zone. It's not going to solve everything, but it's an important step forward. It would reduce tensions. It would essentially eliminate the problem. But that can't be implemented or even initiated unless a large-scale popular movement in the United States acts to compel the government to do something about it. And that cannot happen if nobody even heard about it, if nobody even heard about, say, the Helsinki conference coming up. So the media are doing their job on that one. And the same is true of the second. There is at least a temporary, short-term settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which again could reduce conflict, set in motion other things. The whole world is in favor of it, except for the United States and Israel. So we know exactly where the problem is. And that's a very optimistic conclusion, I think, in both cases, because the one thing we can influence in the world is the policies of this country, to the extent that it becomes a democratic society, and to the extent that we can overcome what one of the founders of modern political science, Hans Morgenthau, called our conformist subservience to those in power, the pathology of the educated population.